On the 11th of June, the village of St. Anselm's put on its brightest face and its cleanest tablecloths, for it was the day of the vicarage garden fete. The lawns behind the vicarage, usually the preserve of wheezing croquet balls and solemn rose pruning, had been transformed into a cheerful confusion of trestled tables, bunting, and homemade signs. There was a stall for jams, another for knitted comforts for the soldiers' homes, one for second-hand books arranged in a precarious tower that seemed destined to topple, and, of course, a formidable spread of cakes and scones guarded like a fortress by Mrs. Emmeline Price. The vicar moved gently among his flock, murmuring polite phrases that never demanded an answer. Children ran shrieking between legs and chair legs, chased off flower beds by an exasperated gardener. Somewhere, unseen, a gramophone crackled out a scratchy waltz, to which no one paid the slightest attention. It was, as several people remarked complacently, a most suitable day for it. Miss Jane Marple, of St. Mary Mead, sat in a wicker chair under the shade of a lime tree. She was not, strictly speaking, a resident of St. Anselm's, but an old friend of the vicar's wife, Caroline Layton, who had pressed her to come over for a week's visit and had then promptly set her to cutting out paper rosettes for the fete. Miss Marple was knitting, something small and scarlet for a great niece, and her pale blue eyes observed, behind the mildness of spectacles, everything and everyone. "It's so nice," said Caroline Layton, subsiding into the chair beside her with a little gasp. Only one quarrel over the raffle books, and that was settled with remarkable Christian restraint. "I dare say," said Miss Marple. "Human nature is extraordinarily adaptable when there are onlookers." Caroline laughed. "You do make everyone sound so dreadful, Jane." "Oh, no," said Miss Marple placidly. "Only ordinary." Her attention, though apparently content with the play of sunlight on the teacups, had fixed itself on a small knot of people by the tombola stall. A tall, thin woman in an expensive but slightly too youthful dress. A burly man with a reddened neck and a watch chain that declared self-made prosperity. A younger woman with an anxious, pinched expression, and a curate attempting to be tactful and failing. "That will be Mrs. Langford," supplied Caroline, following her glance. "The new people at Old Mill House. She's on the fete committee, officially. Though one might say," Caroline pursed her lips, "one might say she prefers to direct rather than to do." "And the gentleman?" Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. "Her husband, Mr. Henry Langford, retired, something in shipping, I believe, very generous to the church roof fund, which is what matters. The poor girl beside them is their niece, Alice. They've only had her down from London a few months. I gather," her voice lowered automatically, "there were difficulties." Miss Marple did not inquire further. Difficulties could mean so many very simple human things. Drink, men, money, pride. She watched instead the attitude of the group. Mrs. Langford's bright, overwrought smile. Henry Langford's tight jaw, the way Alice's hands twisted in her skirt when addressed, sharply. Nearer at hand, another little drama unfolded. Mrs. Emmeline Price, stout and powdered, guarding her Victoria sponge like a dragon, was being importuned by a fair-haired man in his 30s, whose expression of mock pleading did not quite reach his eyes. "Surely, Mrs. Price, you can't still be cross with me," he was saying lightly. "You must let bygones be bygones. Besides, I've brought money. 2 whole tickets worth of cake." Mrs. Price's mouth compressed. "Some things, Mr. Crane, are not to be made up with tickets or charm." She spat the last word faintly, as though it was something sour. "That is Mr. Lionel Crane," murmured Caroline. "He's taken the lease of the old brewery, turning it into some sort of artistic retreat. People like that are never quite sound, in my experience." "Artistic people?" asked Miss Marple. Caroline colored. "Business people who don't go to church," she amended weakly. "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "they, too, are very much human nature." It was all human nature. In the amiable malice of Mrs. Price's stare, the over-brightness of Mrs. Langford's laughter, The way the vicar flinched almost imperceptibly when Lionel Crane clapped him on the shoulder. A village fete was really an excellent parade of the species. At 3:30, the raffle was drawn. At 3:45, Henry Langford stood up to make a little speech of thanks and to announce an additional donation for the roof appeal. My wife and I feel so very welcomed. And at 4, the first grey clouds drifted in, and people began to think of Macintoshes and the washing they had left out. It was precisely at 11 minutes past 4 that the scream came. It was not the shriek of a child fallen on gravel, nor the affected cry some young ladies give for excitement. It was deep, tearing, the sound of a person whose mind had suddenly and violently refused to admit what the eyes perceived. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Teacups clinked back into saucers. The gramophone crackled on, absurdly jaunty, until someone silenced it. Caroline Layton's hand gripped Miss Marple's arm painfully. "That came from the old mill-house path," she whispered. "Jane? Oh, Jane." On the gravel path leading to the side gate, where one could slip away from the fate unnoticed, a small group had already begun to form, their bodies instinctively drawing back from something on the ground. Miss Marple rose, her knitting sliding into her bag. She moved forward without haste, but with the quiet certainty of one who knows that once human nature has been startled into violence, nothing is ever quite the same again. There was a brief, stunned silence, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Then, as so often happens when the unnatural intrudes upon the well-ordered routine of English life, everyone began to speak at once. "Dead? What utter nonsense," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, though her voice lacked conviction. "People don't simply drop dead on the day of the harvest festival. It's too melodramatic." "Heart attack, most likely," Dr. Haydock muttered briskly, as though wishing to impose a rational explanation by force of will. "Crane's been smoking far too much. I've told him as much." "Where is he, Vance? The cottage?" Timothy Vance, who had been standing rigid as a toy soldier, swallowed hard. "In his study, on the floor. I didn't touch anything." "Very wise of you, Timothy," Miss Marple remarked gently, rising with a slight wince that owed more to age than emotion. "I think perhaps that someone should telephone the police at once. There is Inspector Slack, is there not, who has taken such an interest in our little village on previous occasions?" Her tone was mild and conversational, as though they were discussing the best method of preserving gooseberries. Reverend Clement recovered himself with an effort. Yes, of course. The police." He glanced around vaguely. "The telephone is in the study." No, of course it isn't. It's in my study. I shall ring them immediately." As he hurried away, the group began to shift and reform like a disturbed ant nest. Some of the younger villagers, led by Timothy, moved toward the path that led to Blackwood Cottage, only to be halted by Dr. Haydock. "No one goes in until the police arrive," he said sharply. "We don't know the cause of death. We mustn't disturb the surroundings." "But you're going, aren't you, Doctor?" Dorothy Bantry's voice held a strained, brittle note. "If he's ill, if there's any chance..." "If there's any chance, it's already gone," Haydock replied bluntly. "From the boy's description. Still, I'll go and make certain for the record. Miss Marple, would you care to join me?" There was a curious deference in his tone, rooted in the memory of previous occasions when her gentle observations had proved more penetrating than official methods. "If it's not too much trouble, dear doctor," Miss Marple said. "I do so dislike uneven ground. It catches one unexpectedly." They walked together along the narrow path, the murmur of shocked conversation fading behind them. The late roses that lined the vicarage hedge seemed too bright, too alive, in contrast to the grim errand on which they were bound. Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in the small details: the trampled edge of a flower bed, a smear of mud on the otherwise tidy gravel, a dropped program from the festival lying near the cottage gate. Blackwood Cottage, with its thatched roof and low, beamed ceilings, had always seemed to Miss Marple one of the more amiable of the village houses, its history of mild scandal and minor eccentricity, giving it character without malice. It looked now as peaceful as ever, lace curtains unmoving at the windows, a small clay pot of late geraniums bright on the sill. Timothy hesitated at the door. It wasn't locked, he said, his hand shaking slightly as he indicated the brass handle. I called out, of course. Then I saw him. I didn't go in further than the doorway. Quite right, Dr. Haydock approved. He pushed open the door and stepped into the narrow hall, Miss Marple just behind him, small and neat, and apparently quite unruffled. The study was at the back, a pleasant room overlooking the tiny garden. Lionel Crane lay on the worn Persian rug in front of his desk, his body at an awkward angle, one arm flung out as though in protest. His eyes stared up at the ceiling with a glazed fixity that admitted no doubt as to his condition. Haydock knelt, performing the necessary examination with swift, practiced movements. After a minute, he rose and looked at Miss Marple with an expression that was both troubled and reluctant. "Well," she asked quietly. "He's been dead for at least half an hour, possibly more," the doctor said. "And it isn't a heart attack. There's a faint odor, bitter almond. I think you know what that suggests, Miss Marple." "Indeed I do," Miss Marple replied, her voice very soft, though one hesitates to speak the word before the proper authorities have arrived. "Still, it would seem that Mr. Crane's announcement will not, after all, be made by Mr. Crane himself." Her gaze moved slowly about the room, taking in the half-empty teacup on the desk, the neatly stacked papers, the open window with its gently stirring curtain. On the blotter lay a single sheet of paper weighted by a fountain pen, as though someone had been interrupted mid-sentence. She did not approach the desk. Long experience had taught her the value of leaving things undisturbed. But she noted, with that meticulous attention to small things that had so often been her greatest ally, a faint ring of moisture on the wood beside the cup, as though another glass or cup had once stood there and been removed. "Poison," she murmured under her breath, more to herself than to the doctor. "Poison, and an announcement to be made at 4 o'clock that concerns everyone in the village. One cannot help but feel, dear doctor, that Mr. Crane has chosen a very inconvenient time to die." Outside, faintly, they could hear the rising hum of voices as the news spread across the vicarage lawn like spilled ink in St. Mary Mead. No event remained private for long. Inspector Slack, having established the rudiments of authority, began the laborious process of separating the crowd into manageable portions. He installed himself at a small table hastily cleared of Victoria sponges and jam jars, commandeering the vicarage's guest book to serve as an impromptu register. "Names first," he barked. "Then, where you were between 2 and 4 o'clock, we'll have no nonsense about it being too difficult to remember." It did, of course, prove difficult for many to remember with precision, though Miss Marple noted that this difficulty was often curiously selective. Mrs. Clement, for instance, could recall at great length a remark made by the organist about her gooseberry jam at precisely 3:30, but could not, for the life of her, remember whether she had gone to the lavatory before or after the bells chimed 3. Dorothy Bantry approached the table with the air of one going to the gallows. The corner of blue paper still protruded from her coat pocket. She made a small, furtive movement as though to push it further out of sight, then seemed to think better of it, her hand dropping limply to her side. "Name?" Slack asked, though he knew perfectly well who she was. "Dorothy Bantry. Where were you between 2 and 4? "Here. On the lawn." She swallowed. "Mostly." "Mostly?" Slack's pencil paused ominously. I went into the church for a few minutes before 3. It was quite hot out here and I felt faint." Her voice sharpened suddenly. "I didn't go anywhere near Blackwood Cottage, if that's what you're thinking." "I wasn't thinking anything of the kind," said Slack, immediately thinking exactly that. "How long were you in the church?" "I don't know. 10 minutes, perhaps. 15. Miss Marple, knitting serenely in the background, recalled that Dorothy had been absent from the lawn for nearer 25 minutes by her own quiet observation, not in itself incriminating, but certainly worth remembering. More interesting still was the way Dorothy kept pressing her lips tightly together, as though to prevent some dangerous truth from slipping out unbidden. The afternoon wore on, the sky deepening to a mellow gold. One by one, villagers gave their halting accounts of the afternoon's movements. Patterns began to emerge, like a complicated piece of lace gradually revealing its design. Nearly everyone claimed to have been on the vicarage lawn for the better part of the crucial hour, with only brief excursions for lavatories, telephone calls, and the occasional forgotten errand. When it came time for Miss Marple's own statement, she approached the table with her usual mild courtesy. Name? Jane Marple. Where were you between 2 and 4, Miss Marple? Why, right here, Inspector. Under the elm tree. I have rather a good view from that spot, you know. One sees a great deal without appearing to do so, human nature being what it is. Slack suppressed an irritated sigh. And you saw nothing of any relevance to this case, I suppose? Miss Marple considered delicately. Oh, I shouldn't like to say that. One sees all sorts of little things. For instance, Mr. Ashford leaving the lawn by the side gate at 3:30 and returning at 10 to 4 with mud on his shoes. And dear Dorothy dropping that blue paper which she is now so anxious to conceal. And then there's the interesting matter of Mrs. Clement's hem. Her hem? Slack repeated blankly. Yes, such a curious color, don't you think? That reddish clay is really very distinctive. One finds it only in a few places about St. Mary Mead. The path down to the brook, certainly, and the lane near Blackwood Cottage. She smiled gently. Of course, I dare say there may be other places as well. Inspector Slack's pencil had begun to move rapidly. You saw all this while sitting under a tree, did you? One sees a great deal from a good vantage point, Inspector. My nephew Raymond is always teasing me about my fondness for park benches, but they are really most instructive. He eyed her suspiciously. And you didn't think to mention these observations earlier? Oh, but you hadn't asked me earlier, Miss Marple pointed out, her expression all innocent confusion. And I do know how busy you are in the first hour. So much to organize, bodies to examine, statements to take. I didn't wish to be a nuisance. Slack grunted something indistinct and waved her away, though the set of his jaw suggested he would indeed be making further inquiries into muddy hems and blue papers. By the time the last reluctant villager had given their account, the light was beginning to fade, and a chill had settled over the vicarage lawn. The once festive tables now seemed oddly desolate, the abandoned cakes and half-empty teacups bearing silent witness to the afternoon's violent interruption. That will be all for today, Inspector Slack announced. No one is to leave the village without informing me. I'll be examining Mr. Crane's cottage myself now, with Dr. Haydock and Sergeant Price. The body will be removed to the mortuary at Much Benham. Until then, I suggest you all go home and try to remember anything at all, that seemed out of place today. The crowd began to disperse slowly in 2s and 3s. Voices dropped to eager whispers as soon as they were out of the inspector's earshot. Already theories were forming, accusations hinted, alliances shifting in the complex social web of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, walking home at a measured pace along the familiar high street, heard fragments of conversation drift to her on the cool evening air. Always said he had a past. That poor girl, Dorothy, she'll be utterly done for if... Doctor looked as if he'd seen a ghost when they mentioned 4 o'clock. She noted it all, storing each remark away as carefully as she would have sorted skeins of wool in her work-basket. Human nature, she reflected, was wonderfully consistent. Murder, like illness, merely drew out latent tendencies, fear, greed, jealousy, love, and made them visible to anyone who knew where to look. And there was one thing above all that she could not forget. Mr. Crane had intended to make an important announcement at 4 o'clock, and he had died, violently, before he could utter a single word of it. That, Miss Marple thought, would prove to be the true beginning of the matter. The following morning dawned with an unnatural clarity, the sort of bright, polished sunshine that often follows a storm and seems almost indecent against the knowledge of recent tragedy. St. Mary Mead awoke to the realization that its harvest festival would forever be remembered not for the exceptional blackberry jam or Mrs. Bantry's remarkable marrows, but as the day Mr. Lionel Crane had been murdered. By 9 o'clock, the usual quiet rhythms of village life had been thoroughly disrupted. The telephone at the vicarage rang incessantly, the post office queue spilled out onto the pavement, and curtains twitched in unison as Inspector Slack's motor car was seen, making its way toward Blackwood Cottage. Miss Marple, who believed firmly in facing unpleasantness after a proper breakfast, sat by her window with her porridge and a pot of tea, surveying the village street as calmly, as though she were watching a rather grim but engrossing play. Her neat little house in the High Street afforded an excellent vantage point. From here, she observed Mrs. Clement marching determinedly toward the post office, her skirt now perfectly free of the telltale reddish clay. Dr. Haydock cycling past with unusual haste, his medical bag bouncing precariously from his handlebars, and Dorothy Bantry crossing the street to the vicarage with her shoulders hunched as though bracing herself against more than the mild September breeze. At 9:30 precisely, there came a rap at Miss Marple's door, brisk, official, and entirely unsurprising. "Come in, dear," she called. "The latch is on." Inspector Slack entered with the air of a man resigned to an unpleasant necessity. "Miss Marple," he began, not bothering with preamble, "I suppose you already know more about this wretched business than is good for anyone." "I know no more than anyone who was present yesterday and possesses eyes and ears, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though I have found over the years that people often fail to make use of those particular advantages." He ignored the gentle rebuke. "You mentioned Mr. Trent burning papers. I went to see him last night. He says they were old bills and correspondence from his London flat. Couldn't see the point in carting them about any longer. Perfectly reasonable explanation." "Perfectly," Miss Marple murmured, pouring him tea without asking whether he wanted any. "And the smell?" "The smell? Glossy paper, Inspector, such as one finds in photographs or certain legal documents. Plain correspondence smells quite different when burned. I'm sure you noticed that." Inspector Slack's jaw tightened. "I'm not in the habit of sniffing bonfires, Miss Marple. In any case, Trent denies knowing anything about Mr. Crane's documents. Says he barely knew the man." Miss Marple did not press the point. She had learned long ago that certain types of men resented an excess of helpfulness in women, particularly elderly ones. Instead, she said gently, "You must be quite overwhelmed with possibilities. A secret from so long ago. Why, that's almost always connected to something culpable. I remember a similar situation in Gossington Magna, where a gentleman had kept silent about a certain matter for 27 years. When the truth came out, it caused the most dreadful scandal and a great deal of unhappiness, though in that case no one was murdered. At least, not exactly." Slack eyed her narrowly. "Are you suggesting this is all about some old village scandal?" "I should be very much surprised if it were not," Miss Marple replied serenely. "People do not go to the trouble of committing murder for small reasons. It is almost always love, money, or the fear of disgrace. Often a combination of the three." He sighed heavily. "Well, whether you're surprised or not, here are the facts. Crane's statement, these documents Ashford prepared, are nowhere to be found. Not in the cottage, not in his pockets, not in the solicitor's office. Whoever killed him likely made off with them. And yet," Miss Marple remarked, her eyes drifting to the window, "they still exist. In some form. A prudent man rarely keeps just one copy of something so important, particularly if he was determined to make it public." Slack stared at her, then gave a humorless bark of laughter. "You think he hid another copy somewhere? What are we supposed to do? Search every attic in the village?" "Oh, I shouldn't think it's as difficult as that," said Miss Marple vaguely. "Men like Mr. Crane often have a sentimental streak. They choose hiding places that mean something to them personally. I dare say if one knew more about his past, one might make a very good guess indeed." Inspector Slack muttered something about literary nonsense and rose to leave. At the door, however, he paused. For what it's worth, we've narrowed the time of death to between 3:30 past. That puts most of the village on the vicarage lawn, except for a few useful exceptions. Useful? Miss Marple repeated with an air of gentle curiosity. Mrs. Clement, he said reluctantly, claims she was at the cake stall the whole time. Several people back her up, but none of them actually watched her continuously. Dr. Haydock, alone for nearly 20 minutes in the medical tent, says he was sorting supplies. And Dorothy Bantry, who admits she walked as far as the stream for air. And, of course, Mr. Trent, alone in his garden with his precious incinerator. 4 people with no solid alibis for the exact time of death, and all with some connection to Crane. When he had gone, Miss Marple sat very still for several minutes, her tea growing cold beside her. 4 people without alibis, a missing statement, a secret from 25 years ago, and the peculiar, anxious behavior of almost everyone present. At 11 o'clock, unable to resist the pull of events any longer, she put on her hat and sensible shoes and walked toward the vicarage. The village seemed unusually hushed as though listening. Near the gate, she encountered Dorothy Bantry emerging, her eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, touching her arm, "you look quite done in. Won't you come in and have a word?" Dorothy hesitated, then nodded miserably. "You always see too much, Miss Marple," she whispered. "And I'm so terribly afraid that what I know may have killed him." Miss Marple led her inside, her expression mild, her voice soft and comforting, but her mind very alert indeed. Human nature, she reflected, was once again behaving exactly as it always had, only the particular details differed. And those details, she thought, were beginning to arrange themselves in a disturbingly familiar pattern. Miss Marple let Dorothy's halting confession run its natural course, interjecting only the smallest murmurs of sympathy at appropriate moments. When at last the girl fell silent, spent and pale, Miss Marple spoke with deliberate gentleness. "You've borne a very heavy burden, my dear. Secrets to do with one's origins can weigh upon the mind far more than people realize. But I wonder, this envelope in your pocket?" Her tone remained conversational, almost absent-minded. "Might it be connected to what Mr. Crane discovered?" Dorothy started as if stung, her hand flying instinctively to the blue corner protruding from her coat. For a moment she looked as though she might deny everything, then her shoulders sagged in defeat. "It's a letter from Mr. Crane," she admitted, her voice breaking. "He slipped it into my hand just before the festival began yesterday. I only read it late last night. I didn't tell Inspector Slack because I didn't know how much to reveal without betraying people who may not deserve it. Mr. Crane is beyond help now," Miss Marple said quietly. "But there are others in danger, I fancy. Sometimes a partial truth is more dangerous than candor. May I see it?" Dorothy hesitated, then drew out the envelope with trembling fingers and passed it over. The paper was indeed that distinctive shade of blue, with Lionel Crane's neat, decisive hand on the front. Miss Marple unfolded the single sheet within and adjusted her spectacles. The letter was brief but striking. Crane wrote that his investigations into Dorothy's parentage had confirmed a grave injustice committed in St. Mary Mead 25 years earlier. He stated that a deliberate deception had altered the course of at least 3 lives, that an innocent party had borne the consequences of another's wrongdoing, and that he intended to restore the proper balance by revealing the truth at the Harvest Festival. He urged Dorothy to have courage and assured her that the revelation will shock many, but in the end it will set you free. No names, no dates, no explicit accusations, only hints and moral outrage. At the bottom, however, Miss Marple's eye caught something that made her pause. Beneath his signature, as if added hastily, Crane had written, "P.S. You may find the first piece of proof closer than you think. Ask your aunt about October 1928. Miss Marple refolded the letter carefully. "Has your aunt seen this?" Dorothy shook her head. "No, I couldn't bear to show it to her. Aunt Dolly has been so kind. What if she knew all along? What if she was part of it?" "My dear," Miss Marple said. "In my experience, people are rarely entirely innocent or entirely guilty in such matters. They muddle. They convince themselves they are doing what is best. That does not make them monsters, but it may, unfortunately, lead to very serious consequences." Before Dorothy could reply, footsteps crunched on the gravel path. Colonel Bantry appeared, looking more flustered than Miss Marple had ever seen him. "Dorothy, there you are. Inspector Slack has just been to the house. He's arrested someone." Dorothy shot to her feet. "Arrested? Who?" "Geoffrey Trent," Bantry answered grimly. "They've found fragments of blue paper in his incinerator. Crane's stationery, they think, and something else as well. A blood-stained handkerchief. Slack is convinced he's got his man." A lesser observer might have been satisfied with this neat resolution. Miss Marple merely tightened her lips. "On what grounds precisely?" she asked. Bantry spread his hands. "Trent can't account for his movements between 3:30 and 4:45. Claims he was walking alone by the copse. No witnesses. And he admits burning papers yesterday afternoon. Says they were old letters from a lady friend. Slack thinks he's lying." "Inspector Slack is very fond of tidy answers," Miss Marple murmured. "Real life tends to be rather more untidy." Colonel Bantry hesitated. "Between ourselves, Jane, I don't entirely like the look of it either. Trent's been asking questions in the village for weeks, poking about in old business. Ashford says he came to him, wanting access to records from the late 20s. Something about a disputed inheritance. And now Crane dead, the documents missing, and Trent with a bonfire at just the wrong time. Well, it doesn't look pretty." "It looks," Miss Marple said slowly, "very much as if someone wanted it to look that way." She left Dorothy and the Colonel with a few soothing words and made her way back through the village with deliberate slowness, her mind turning over the developments. Geoffrey Trent as murderer was convenient. Too convenient. A newcomer with no deep roots in St. Mary Mead made an ideal receptacle for suspicion. Yet murder, in her long experience, was far more often committed by those whose lives were intimately entangled with their victims. As she passed the post office, she observed Mrs. Clement engaged in an animated conversation with a small knot of villagers, her hands flying in indignation, her voice carrying clearly. "Always said he was trouble. These city types. Come down here with their secrets and their superior airs. Well, he'll find a village justice is quite as thorough as anything in London, I dare say." Miss Marple noted, with the mildest inward satisfaction, that the postmistress's shoes bore faint traces of reddish smears that had not been there at breakfast time, a detail quite inconsistent with someone who claimed not to have left the building all morning. She continued on to the green, where she found Reverend Clement returning from the police station, his face troubled. "They're very sure of themselves, Jane," he said when she joined him. "Slack is building quite a solid case. Motive, opportunity, physical evidence. And Mr. Trent's manner hasn't helped him. He's sarcastic, defensive, quite uncooperative. He practically invited suspicion. Some people become most unwise when frightened," Miss Marple observed. "Guilt is by no means the only cause of awkward behavior under stress. Innocent men can be exceedingly objectionable when they feel cornered." The vicar sighed. "If Trent didn't do it, then the real killer is still among us, walking free. You truly believe Slack is on the wrong track?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that there are several facts which do not sit comfortably with the idea of Mr. Trent as our murderer. For one thing, whoever killed Mr. Crane must have known enough about our village history to fear the revelation of events from 1928. Mr. Trent has only been here 6 months. That suggests he is, at most, an investigator of the old scandal, not a participant." Her eyes drifted toward the vicarage notice board, where an old Harvest Festival poster from years ago had somehow escaped removal. October 1928. The date leapt out at her. "And for another," she added quietly, more to herself than to the vicar, "there is the very curious matter of who owned Blackwood Cottage before Mr. T. Crane, and how that change of ownership came about. I think, my dear Leonard, that it is high time we paid a call on Mr. Ashford in his professional capacity." Old title deeds can be remarkably talkative if one listens properly. The church clock chimed noon, its notes falling with measured inevitability across the village. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and set her face toward the solicitor's office, her mind already arranging questions with the delicacy of a surgeon preparing instruments for a difficult operation. Somewhere in those yellowing documents, she felt it with absolute certainty, lay the first solid thread that would lead her from rumor and half-truth to the heart of what had really happened in St. Mary Mead 25 years ago. Miss Marple did not immediately act on what she had overheard at the Blue Boar. In her long experience, premature confrontation rarely produced anything but more lies. It was far better to let people reveal themselves under the illusion that their secrets were still safe. That afternoon, Inspector Slack convened what he termed a coordination meeting at the vicarage, to which, somewhat grudgingly, Miss Marple was invited. Present were the vicar and Mrs. Clement in a semi-official capacity, Colonel Bantry as owner of the adjoining estate, and Dr. Poole, Haydock, to offer what the inspector called medical context. Miss Marple, settled unobtrusively in a corner armchair with her knitting, appeared an afterthought. Slack began with a summary that was more dramatic than strictly necessary. We have a victim struck down in his own study with a heavy bronze ornament, scene ransacked. We have missing documents, allegedly containing some explosive old scandal. We have several people who spoke with Crane on the day of his death. And we have, he added with evident relish, at least 3 individuals whose statements do not entirely align with the facts. His eyes traveled pointedly from Mrs. Clement to Dr. Haydock to Colonel Bantry. Mrs. Clement bristled. If you are suggesting, I'm suggesting that your claim not to have left the vicarage lawn is contradicted by physical evidence, Slack said curtly. A parish constable saw you near the lane to Blackwood Cottage shortly before 3:30. And yesterday your skirt bore clay that could only have come from that path. The postmistress went quite still. I walked as far as the hedge to look for Mrs. Price's grandson, she said after a moment. He'd run off and she was worried. I did not go as far as the cottage. I certainly did not enter it. Yet you failed to mention this errand in your first statement, Slack observed. I did not think it important, she snapped. You asked if I had left the festival, and I considered that I had not. I remained within sight of the vicarage the entire time. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. People are often imprecise in their recollections, she said mildly, particularly when they feel they might be blamed for something. I recall Mrs. Humbleby insisting she had never left her sewing room the afternoon Mr. Humbleby's watch went missing, yet it transpired she had stepped out for nearly 20 minutes to speak with a coalman. She had quite forgotten, because she considered it too trivial to count. Slack grunted, unconvinced but unwilling to argue. He turned to Dr. Haydock. You, doctor, claim to have been at the medical tent from 2:30 until nearly 4, with only brief walks to the refreshment table. That's perfectly correct, Haydock replied. There are at least a dozen people who saw me there. And yet, Slack continued, no one seems able to account for your movements between 3:15 and 10 minutes to the hour. That's rather a long, brief interval. Haydock's jaw tightened. I went to my surgery to collect a prescription Mrs. Price needed urgently. I may have been longer than I thought. I was not watching the clock. A convenient gap, Slack observed. Long enough to slip to Blackwood Cottage and back. The doctor's eyes flashed. You are implying. I am implying nothing yet, Slack cut in. I am noting possibilities. Miss Marple, who had been following this exchange with close attention, ventured a soft question. And Mr. Trent, Inspector? You have accounted for his movements at the relevant time? Slack looked annoyed. Trent was in his garden by his own account. No one saw him, but there's no evidence placing him at the cottage. And frankly, Miss Marple, I consider it unlikely that a comparative stranger would be at the center of a 25-year-old village scandal. Strangers, Miss Marple said, sometimes know more than one supposes, particularly when they occupy houses with history. Her gaze met the vicar's, and she saw a flicker of understanding there. Reverend Clement cleared his throat. "There is something I perhaps ought to mention, Inspector. In the church records from October 1928, there is a notation in my predecessor's hand regarding a stillborn child of no name. The mother is not listed, but the address given is Blackwood Cottage." An uncomfortable silence followed. Mrs. Clement spoke first, her voice thin. "You are all determined to drag up ancient miseries for no good purpose. What has that to do with Lionel Crane's death?" "Everything, I suspect," Miss Marple said quietly. "When people will kill to prevent a truth coming out, that truth is very rarely trivial." Before Slack could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. The maid entered, flustered. "Begging your pardon, Vicar, but Mr. Trent is here. He says he must see the inspector at once. He looks very upset, sir." Slack rose with alacrity. "Show him in." Geoffrey Trent entered, hat in hand, face drawn and pale. He looked older than he had that morning at the library. His gaze swept the room, lingered briefly on Miss Marple, and then fixed on the inspector. "I've come," he said hoarsely, "to correct a statement I made yesterday. I wasn't entirely truthful about those papers I burned. And if I don't explain now, I'm afraid someone else in this village may pay for what I failed to do 25 years ago." Miss Marple felt the room sharpen around them, every person leaning forward figuratively, if not literally. The tangled threads of past and present were drawing together, though she knew, by the strained look in Trent's eyes, that the story about to be told would not be a simple one, nor the guilt resting in only one pair of hands. That night, St. Mary Mead slept badly. Windows that usually remained cheerfully unlatched were firmly bolted. Curtains that had always stood half-drawn were pulled close with nervous hands. Yet, despite the village's collective anxiety, one small cottage at the edge of the lane remained as outwardly quiet as ever, its only sign of wakefulness the faint glow of a lamp shading its occupant's silver hair. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk with a small notebook open before her. Her handwriting, neat, spidery, and precise, had formed 3 columns: names, motive, and opportunity. Under names, she had written Dorothy Bantry, Mrs. Clement, Dr. Haydock, Gerald Ashford, Geoffrey Trent, Colonel Bantry. Under motive, the entries varied: Dorothy, fear of truth about her parentage, loyalty to Bantrys. Clement, implicated in concealment, fear of scandal. Haydock, unknown connection to 1928, looked at cottage with anxiety. Ashford, legal complicity, document timeline suspicious. Trent, burning papers, interest in cottage history. Colonel Bantry, determined truth, must never come out. Under opportunity, all had some form of access or plausible absence during the critical half-hour before 4 o'clock. That, Miss Marple reflected, was the way of village crimes. Everyone knew everyone else's comings and goings a little too well, and that made deception both easier and harder. It was close to 11 when a sound reached her. Dull, distant, yet unmistakable. A single, stifled cry, abruptly cut off. It came, she judged, from the direction of the church lane. She rose at once, wrapped a shawl about her shoulders, and moved to the window. The village lay in soft darkness, broken only by the pale wash of the moon and the yellow pools cast by occasional lamps. For a moment, nothing stirred. Then she saw movement near the vicarage gate, a shadow slipping quickly away toward the back path that led in the direction of Blackwood Cottage. She watched carefully. The figure's outline was indistinct, but the gait was familiar. Brisk, slightly stooped from long hours at a desk, not tall. Not a young person's step, but not infirm either. Miss Marple stood very still, then turned away from the window. The vicarage. Something had happened at the vicarage. 10 minutes later, the village was roused again, not by a cry this time, but by the deep tolling of the church bell, rung hastily and out of rhythm. Within half an hour, a small, frightened knot of people had gathered near the vicarage door. Mrs. Bantry in a housecoat with a shawl thrown over her shoulders. Dr. Haydock hastily dressed, and finally Inspector Slack, summoned out of bed with undisguised irritation. Dorothy Bantry was not among them. They found her in the vicarage study, slumped in the armchair by the writing desk. For one dreadful moment, everyone thought she was dead. Then Dr. Haydock bent over her and straightened with a measured breath. "She's alive. Fainted. But there's been—" He broke off, his eyes moving to the desk. On the blotter before Dorothy lay a single sheet of blue paper, Lionel Crane's favored stationery. It was covered in his tight, precise hand, and at the bottom, unmistakable, was his signature. Inspector Slack stepped forward, but Miss Marple, who had slipped quietly in behind the others, was quicker in her observation. The paper was not quite aligned with the blotter. Beneath one corner, just visible, lay another sheet of ordinary cream writing paper. Someone had slipped Crane's statement over another document and done so in haste. Dorothy stirred, her lashes fluttering. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse with shock. "It was on my pillow," she whispered, "when I went up to bed. The letter from Mr. Crane, it said everything. Who my mother was, who my father was. I came here to show Uncle Leonard. I don't remember anything after that." Inspector Slack seized the blue sheet with gloved hands and scanned it rapidly, his eyes narrowing. Well, this is interesting. Very interesting indeed." It was more than interesting. It was devastating. The document named Sarah Miller as Dorothy's mother and with chilling clarity identified her father. Not some long-deceased stranger, but a highly respected man whose name still carried authority in village and county. Not Colonel Bantry, as some might have whispered, but his closest friend and business associate, Sir Alan Meredith, now dead several years. Miss Marple observed the room carefully. Mrs. Bantry sagged against the door frame in visible relief. Colonel Bantry, summoned minutes later, went the color of old parchment but said nothing at all. Gerald Ashford, arriving breathless, stared at the document with the frozen expression of a man watching years of careful management crumble in an instant. Yet it was not the named father that interested Miss Marple most. It was the second sheet of paper still half concealed beneath Crane's statement. While Inspector Slack argued with Colonel Bantry about who had known what and when, Miss Marple moved closer to the desk. Her fingers, apparently fussing with the inkstand, gently shifted the top paper just enough to reveal a single line of cramped handwriting on the sheet beneath. It was Dorothy's own hand, and the half-visible words made Miss Marple's blood run just a little colder. "Cannot bear it. Better to end it than live with—" The sentence broke off there. Someone had interrupted Dorothy Bantry as she wrote what might have been a Armwell note. Miss Marple straightened very slowly. There had been another crime tonight, not completed, thank Providence, but attempted. Someone had wanted Dorothy silenced every bit as much as Lionel Crane, and that, she reflected grimly, changed everything. The search parties fanned out from the mill house under Inspector Slack's direction, lanterns and torches bobbing through the encroaching dusk. Voices called Dorothy's name across the fields and along the hedgerows, their urgency swallowed by the gathering dark. Miss Marple, who knew the futility of unfocused effort, returned instead to her cottage, where clear thinking and a good fire might accomplish more than tramping through undergrowth. She lit the lamp, set her kettle on the hob, and laid out on the table the small constellation of objects and facts that had accumulated around the case. Lionel Crane's letter. To Dorothy, the copy she had made of the baptismal entry, a rough sketch of the village showing the mill house, Blackwood Cottage, and the vicarage, and a list of names with brief notes beside each. At the top stood Dorothy, child of Sarah Miller, adopted by Bantrys, abducted. Beneath, Colonel Bantry, overheard, girl must never know. Then Ashford, solicitor in both 1928 matter and baptism, timeline false pen documents. Followed by Dr. Haydock, unusually agitated, connection to Crane, to Sarah, and Mrs. Clement, knew of child's parentage, clay on skirt, midwife to Dorothy, loyal to someone. Finally, Trent, Cottage tenant, burning papers, alarm, accident article. She sat back, hands folded, and considered them not as isolated names, but as human beings. Men and women capable of affection, fear, cowardice, and self-deception. Murder, in her experience, rarely sprang from abstract wickedness. It grew instead from perfectly ordinary emotions allowed to run their natural, if disastrous, course. It was while she was thus engaged that a knock sounded at her door. Quick, nervous, and hesitant. Opening it, she found Geoffrey Trent on the step, his face pale, his hair slightly disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it repeatedly. "Miss Marple, forgive the hour," he began abruptly. "But I heard about Miss Bantry's disappearance, and I believe I may have information the police ought to know. I confess I do not entirely trust Inspector Slack to make the proper use of it." Miss Marple stepped aside. "Do come in, Mr. Trent. I was just making tea. People often think more clearly when their hands are occupied." He accepted the cup she offered, but did not drink. "When I took Blackwood Cottage," he said, "I discovered a small locked compartment beneath the floorboards in what is now my study. The key was missing, but I was able to open it. Inside were letters, old, yellowed, some tied with ribbon, and a few legal-looking documents. They concerned a young woman named Sarah Miller and a child. Illegitimate, apparently." He glanced at her sharply, as if expecting shock. When Miss Marple merely nodded, he continued. "I mentioned the find to Lionel Crane at the Rose and Crown some weeks ago, thinking he might be interested from a historical perspective. He insisted I show him everything at once. After reading the papers, he became quite grim, said there had been a grave injustice, that people in the village had lived under false pretenses for decades, and that he meant to put it right." "And the documents?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "What became of them?" "I gave them to Crane. All of them." Trent stared into his untouched tea. "But 3 days ago, I received an anonymous note pushed under my door. It warned me that if I valued my peace, I was to burn any remaining papers from that compartment and say nothing of what had been there. I assumed Crane had made enemies with his talk. So, I did as I was advised." Miss Marple's needles, which she had taken up automatically, moved in a slow, thoughtful rhythm. "And you told no one? Not even Inspector Slack?" "I feared being blamed for stirring up the past. I have had experience of small communities turning on outsiders. But now, with Miss Bantry missing..." He broke off, the implication too obvious to state. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Trent," Miss Marple said. "You have been placed in a difficult position. Fear can make cowards of almost anyone. The important thing is that we understand now how much Lionel Crane actually knew, and how he came by his knowledge." After Trent left, she rang the vicarage and requested that Colonel Bantry call on her without delay. The colonel arrived looking 10 years older than he had at the Harvest Festival, the bluff good humor worn thin, his eyes avoiding hers. "Miss Marple," he began heavily, "I suppose you've heard about the girl. Slack's all over the place, of course. Damned incompetent. If anything's happened to Dorothy, Colonel," Miss Marple said gently, "I believe the time has come for complete frankness. About Dorothy. About 1928, and about what you and Mr. Ashford discussed at the Blue Boar yesterday." His mouth fell open. "You overheard us?" "Not intentionally, but words have a way of carrying in small, echoing rooms. You said the girl must never know, that it would ruin everything." He sank into the chair by the fire, shoulders slumping. For a long moment, he stared into the flames, as though seeking there the courage to face what must be said. "Very well," he muttered at last. "If I don't tell you, you'll piece it together anyway. Dorothy is not Dolly's and my child. You've guessed that much. Sarah Miller was a foolish business from my youth. I was a young officer on leave. She was a pretty maid. I meant her no harm, but when she became, in trouble, I was already engaged to Dolly. My family would have been ruined. Ashford arranged matters, a small allowance, promises. Then Sarah died in that wretched fall, and the child, Well, she existed. And something had to be done. Miss Marple's expression softened. You took her in. Dolly insisted, said we could at least give the child a decent life. No one knew. Ashford handled the paperwork. It was all very tidy. His voice turned harsh. Until Crane came along, prying, waving those damned old letters, the ones I wrote Sarah, full of youthful nonsense. He meant to expose everything at the festival. My daughter's illegitimacy, my past disgrace. Dolly would have been destroyed. And you argued with him. Yes, I begged him to consider Dorothy. He wouldn't hear of it. Said truth was truth. We quarreled outside the Rose and Crown, but I swear to you, Miss Marple, I did not kill him. I went home. Dolly will tell you. I'm a coward, perhaps, but not a murderer. Miss Marple believed him. Weakness, yes. Evasion, certainly. But not the cold, arranging mind that had killed once and was prepared to kill again. Someone else had taken more from Crane's discovery than shame. Someone who stood to lose not only reputation, but property or status in a very practical sense. As the colonel left, the church clock struck 9. Miss Marple rose, decision crystallizing. It was time, she thought, to prod the true culprit into betraying themselves. And the best way to do that was to let it be known, very quietly, that Lionel Crane's missing documents were not, after all, entirely lost. Miss Marple did not immediately seek out Inspector Slack with her latest insights. Long experience had taught her that while the police were invaluable for handcuffs and handcarts, they were often less helpful in matters requiring delicacy. Before the blackmailer could be confronted, they had to be brought quite gently to show their hand. Her first call was at the vicarage under the pretext of inquiring after Dorothy. The girl, though still pale and shaken from her ordeal at the mill, insisted on seeing her. I don't understand any of it, Dorothy said, fingers twisting in her lap. Mr. Crane, the mill house, those awful notes. And now Uncle Arthur says there are complicated legal matters I mustn't worry my head about. There are indeed legal matters, Miss Marple agreed, but far more important, there are moral ones. Tell me, my dear, when Mr. Crane spoke of his proof, did he mention where he had found any of it? Dorothy frowned, searching her memory. He said some things were in old parish records, some in letters he found hidden in a false panel at Blackwood Cottage. But he was especially pleased about a document he called the Keystone. A legal paper, he said, that tied everything together. He told me, when that sees daylight, certain people will wish they'd been more honest in 1928. A legal paper, Miss Marple repeated. And who in this village has had custody of most people's legal papers for the last quarter of a century? Mr. Ashford, of course, Dorothy said slowly. But Mr. Ashford has always been so kind. He arranged my adoption. He helped Uncle Arthur with the estate. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. He has been most helpful to very many people. As she left the vicarage, she encountered Geoffrey Trent coming down the lane, a leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm. He started slightly upon seeing her, then recovered with forced politeness. Miss Marple, I hear Dorothy has been found, that is, rescued. Remarkable good fortune. Fortune often has less to do with it than patience and observation, she said placidly. You are keeping busy, I see. Oh, just sketches, he replied too quickly. The church chiefly. I find ecclesiastical architecture soothing. Her eye had already noted the faint dark smudges along his fingers and cuff, chemical stains of some sort. And she remembered Dorothy's description of the sharp, medicinal smell in the cellar. Photography can be so demanding, I always think, she remarked mildly. All those trays and solutions. My nephew Raymond once ruined an excellent carpet with fixer. I do hope you have a proper dark room. Trent's eyes flickered. I don't. That is, I developed the odd plate in my kitchen. Nothing elaborate. How very adaptable, she said, as though discussing knitting wool. And economical, too, particularly if one already has a steady income from other activities. His lips tightened. I'm not sure what you mean. Oh, I think you are. Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as ever. After all, a man taking the lease on a rather expensive cottage with no visible means of support must have some source of funds. One wonders whether certain documents, held in trust for vulnerable clients, might not have strayed. By the time she reached her own cottage, the outline was clear. Geoffrey Trent was not merely an idle lodger. He was Gerald Ashford's nephew. She had confirmed that in the parish files, taken into partnership unofficially after some unspecified trouble in London. A young man with technical skill in forgery and photography, attached to a solicitor with long access to other people's secrets. It was, as she thought with inward severity, a most unsavory combination. What remained to be tested was who had led and who had followed. She sent out 3 brief notes by hand-delivered message, each phrased with innocent vagueness. One to Mrs. Clement, one to Mr. Ashford, and one to Inspector Slack. They all said essentially the same thing. I believe I have located a second copy of Mr. Crane's statement, and perhaps the document he referred to as the keystone. As this concerns several villagers, it might be best to discuss the matter quietly at the vicarage drawing room at 7 o'clock this evening, before wider steps are taken. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple. By 6:30 she was at the vicarage, ostensibly to help Mrs. Clement arrange the tea things. The postmistress arrived early, her composure brittle, eyes darting nervously about the room. "It would be better if this didn't go any further, Miss Marple," she said in a low, urgent tone. "Dorothy is safe. Must we rake over what happened so long ago? Think what it will do to the Colonel and Mrs. Bantry." "I have thought of that a great deal," Miss Marple replied. "But there is also Lionel Crane, who is dead, and Dorothy herself, who has been kept in ignorance. And there is the small matter of money, Mrs. Clement, money drawn regularly over 25 years, ostensibly for legal expenses that far exceeded any reasonable fee." Mrs. Clement flinched. "I never saw a penny of it, I swear. I kept the secret, for the child's sake, I thought. But the money went through Ashford's hands. I assumed he was investing it on Dorothy's behalf." "Did you?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Or did you simply prefer not to inquire too closely?" The arrival of Gerald Ashford cut short any answer. The solicitor entered with his usual controlled politeness, but there was sweat at his temples despite the cool evening air. "You sent me a most intriguing note, Miss Marple," he said, attempting a smile. "A second copy of Crane's statement, you say? I must warn you, there are issues of client privilege to consider. Inspector Slack will no doubt guide us on that," Miss Marple said mildly, as the door opened again to admit the inspector, solid and suspicious as ever. Geoffrey Trent followed at his uncle's heel, portfolio still under his arm, clearly not invited but unwilling to be left out of any discussion involving incriminating documents. Miss Marple took in their positions with quiet satisfaction. Ashford by the mantel, Trent hovering near the sideboard, Mrs. Clement at the tea table, Slack at the door. It was a little like arranging chess pieces for the final exchange. "I fear I may have been unclear," she began, settling her knitting in her lap. "I did not say I had the documents, only that I believe Mr. Crane, being a cautious man, would hardly entrust the only copy of such important material to his own keeping." Ashford gave a short laugh that was too sharp to be natural. "You are speculating, Miss Marple." "But on fairly solid ground," she replied. "When one knows that certain gentlemen kept a locked drawer in their office for special matters, and that another gentleman has the technical skill to reproduce signatures and watermarks with troubling accuracy." Geoffrey Trent spoke for the first time, his voice edged. "Are you accusing me of forgery, Miss Marple?" "Oh no," she said gently. "I believe you to be a very competent forger indeed." Inspector Slack straightened, eyes narrowing. "Perhaps you'd care to explain that remark?" "I think it will be better," Miss Marple said, her gaze moving from uncle to nephew, "if Mr. Ashford explains precisely what became of Sarah Miller's original settlement papers, and why certain receipts in Colonel Bantry's accounts bear signatures that are not, in fact, his. And then perhaps Mr. Trent might tell us why he was observed burning glossy paper, photographic paper, on the afternoon of the murder. The room went very still. Ashford's hand, reaching for a handkerchief, froze. Trent's grip tightened on the portfolio. Slack looked from one to the other with dawning understanding. Miss Marple folded her hands, her blue eyes mild but unyielding. "I think, Inspector," she said softly, "that we are nearly at the end of our puzzle. What remains is to see how our friends react when they realize that the past they have profited from so long is finally, irrevocably, about to be exposed." The following days in St. Mary Mead were filled with the subdued bustle that always followed a scandal of significant proportions. Life resumed its outward rhythm. Post was delivered, curtains were shaken, milk appeared on doorsteps, but beneath the routine beat a quieter undercurrent of shock and rearrangement. Villagers spoke in lowered tones outside shops and in pews, and many an errand took longer than usual as people paused to whisper, compare versions, and, inevitably, improve upon them. Inspector Slack, having finally obtained a confession from Geoffrey Trent and a full statement from Gerald Ashford, requested that all principal parties meet at the vicarage to hear the official account. It was, Miss Marple reflected, curiously like the closing of a parish committee meeting, except that the matter at hand involved murder, blackmail, and the collapse of several carefully maintained illusions. They gathered in the drawing room, Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, white-faced and strained. Dorothy, pale but composed, seated close to Mrs. Bantry's side. Dr. Haydock, looking 10 years older. Mrs. Clement, rigid with a dignity that barely held. Mr. Ashford, wan and defeated. And Reverend Clement, who hovered with a kind of stunned pastoral helplessness. Inspector Slack cleared his throat and began, but found his account interrupted very gently by Miss Marple, who sat near the fire with her knitting in her lap, the picture of harmless domesticity. "If I might, Inspector," she said in her mildest tone, "perhaps it would be easier for everyone if the sequence were put quite plainly. People can bear most things, I find, if they are told the truth in the proper order." Slack, who had learned something in previous cases about the practical value of Miss Marple's proper order, gave a grudging nod. "Very well, Miss Marple, since you seem to have had the right of it all along." She folded her hands. "It began 25 years ago, when Sarah Miller fell to her death at Blackwood Cottage. That death was accidental, but conveniently so for a frightened young officer and for others who preferred not to look too closely. No inquest will be reopened now. What's done is done. But it did not end there. Sarah left behind a child. Through Mr. Ashford's arrangements, that child was quietly adopted by Colonel and Mrs. Bantry. Dorothy received love, education, and position, everything a girl might wish. The only thing she lacked was the truth. Mr. Ashford, however, did not bury all the papers he should have buried. He kept copies, letters, the original medical notes, the private memorandum about the baptism. Alone, he might never have used them, but then came Geoffrey Trent, Sarah's brother. All eyes turned to the empty space where Trent might have been standing. Mr. Trent returned to St. Mary Mead under an assumed name, ostensibly as a tenant, but in truth as a man seeking redress and advantage. He found Ashford's old files, convinced or coerced him into cooperation, and between them they created a profitable arrangement. Not crude demands, oh no, that would have been noticeable. Instead, necessary legal expenses, quiet transfers, little pressures applied here and there over many years. The Bantrys thought they were paying to keep a tragic accident from becoming scandal. In reality, they were paying an ongoing premium on their own silence. Colonel Bantry stirred, but said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the carpet. "Then Lionel Crane came," Miss Marple continued. "He took the cottage where the original tragedy occurred. Not by coincidence, I think. Mr. Trent recommended it, knowing precisely what lay in its old cupboards and forgotten drawers. But Trent miscalculated. Crane was not a man to discover such a history and simply look away. He spoke to Dr. Haydock about the old injuries, to Mrs. Clement about the birth, to Mr. Ashford about the irregular papers. He wrote to Dorothy, hinting at her true origin and announcing his intention to reveal everything at the Harvest Festival. He even prepared a formal statement. Had he lived to read it, the quiet system of blackmail would have collapsed overnight. Dorothy's hand tightened on Mrs. Bantry's. The older woman raised her chin, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Trent could not allow that," Miss Marple said softly. "He had built his life on this secret. Money, yes, but also a peculiar sort of revenge. Seeing the Bantry child, Sarah's child, living the comfortable life his sister had been denied, that must have rankled most bitterly. He watched the festival from the edges. He saw Mrs. Clement's anxious visit, timed his own. When Crane refused money, Trent waited until the right moment, about 3:45, when the field was busiest, and few would notice his absence. He entered by the back, with a key he had long possessed as former agent for the property, found Crane in his study, and struck him from behind with the bronze statuette. Quick, efficient, with enough violence to silence and to satisfy his own resentment. Inspector Slack coughed. "He's admitted as much. Says Crane left him no choice. He then ransacked the room," Miss Marple went on, partly for appearance, partly to seize all copies of the statement. What he didn't realize was that Crane had already hinted to others and left traces elsewhere. That is the difficulty with truth. It spreads, even when written on scraps, Mrs. E. Clement made a faint sound, half sob, half exhale. "The attempted abduction of Dorothy," Miss Marple continued, "was his second error. Panicked by the pace of the investigation, rattled when I mentioned burning paper and when Inspector Slack pressed Ashford, Trent decided Dorothy knew more than she did. He staged her flight, left that clumsy note, and hid her in the mill cellar with the intention, I fear, of a more permanent arrangement once suspicion had shifted. But in his haste, he overarranged the scene. It rang false. Dorothy shivered. Mrs. Bantry drew her closer. "As for Mr. Ashford," Miss Marple concluded, turning her clear gaze on the solicitor, "he was not the originator, but he was a willing, if cowardly, accomplice. He typed the notes, laundered the payments, and looked the other way for far too long. Fear and self-interest, I imagine, more than bloodlust." Ashford bowed his head. "I never meant for anyone to die," he whispered. "Few do," Miss Marple said quietly. "But once one begins building on deception, every further compromise feels easier, until one reaches a point from which one cannot draw back." Silence followed. Outside, a cart rattled past, absurdly ordinary. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with an air of finality. "Trent will be charged with murder and attempted murder. Ashford with conspiracy and blackmail. There'll be trials enough to occupy the circuit judges for some time." One by one, they drifted away, each carrying their own burden. Guilt, confusion, reluctant relief. Dorothy lingered last. "Miss Marple," she said, when the room was nearly empty, "am I wrong to feel both horrified and strangely freed?" "No, my dear," Miss Marple replied, patting her hand. "You have lost an illusion, which is always painful, but you have gained the truth about yourself. One may build honestly upon that. Love given to you does not become less real because it began in fear. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry loved you truly. That is what matters now." Later, in the peaceful clutter of her own sitting room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting where she had left off days before. Outside, the village seemed to exhale. Windows opened for airing, children's voices rose tentatively in play, and the rhythm of ordinary life reasserted itself, as it always did. People would say, in time, that the whole affair had been very shocking. They would lower their voices over tea and speak of poor Sarah and wicked Trent and how one never really knew about solicitors. They would, for the most part, forget the quieter, more ordinary failings that had allowed the tragedy to take root. The cowardice of a young man, the complacency of professionals, the convenience of looking away. Miss Marple, who never forgot such things, reflected that human nature was curiously consistent, whether in great houses or small cottages. Secrets, once planted, grew in much the same way as bindweed, wrapping themselves around whatever they could reach, choking growth and resisting all but the most determined effort to remove them. She counted her stitches, satisfied that the pattern, at least on her needles, was coming out quite as it should. In St. Mary Mead, the bells rang for evensong, and life went on, if not unchanged, then at least continuing. Somewhere, a young woman was beginning to understand that her worth did not depend upon her parentage, and an old soldier was facing at last the truth of his youth. And in a small, lace-curtained cottage, an elderly lady finished a row of pale blue wool and thought, not unkindly, that people were very much the same everywhere, capable of great kindness and great cruelty, of folly and courage, often in the same lifetime. It was, she reflected, what made murder so sadly predictable, and its detection, in a way, almost simple once one understood the pattern. Autumn settled more firmly over St. Mary Mead in the days that followed, softening the sharp edges of recent events. The leaves along the lane to Miss Marple's cottage turned to gold and copper, and a faint wood-smoke haze hung in the evening air, as though the village itself were gently drawing a veil over what had passed. Life, being stubbornly inclined to continue, resumed its ordinary rhythms. The vicar's wife organized a harvest relief committee for those spiritually unsettled by recent happenings, which in practice meant extra tea and seed cake after Sunday service. Mrs. Clement returned to her post office counter, a little quieter and more deliberate in her manner. Haydock resumed his brisk calls, though there were new lines of gravity about his mouth. It was perhaps a fortnight after Geoffrey Trent's arrest that Dorothy Bantry came to see Miss Marple alone. She arrived without her aunt or uncle, walking up the garden path with the tentative step of someone not yet accustomed to her own altered life. Miss Marple, who had been deadheading a particularly stubborn Rose, straightened with her usual unhurried grace. "My dear," she said, as though Dorothy were merely early for tea, "you are looking much better. A little pale still, but that is to be expected. One does not have one's entire life rearranged in a week without some faintness." Dorothy managed a small smile and allowed herself to be guided into the sitting room. When they were settled, with proper tea and a plate of shortbread Miss Marple had acquired from the vicar's wife, Dorothy folded her hands in her lap and spoke with surprising steadiness. "I wanted to thank you," she began, for finding me at the mill, for seeing the truth of things when the rest of us could not. But there is something else as well." She hesitated, then drew from her handbag a thin bundle of papers, folded and refolded until the edges had grown soft. "I thought you ought to see these. They're Mr. Crane's statement, the one everyone believed had gone missing. He left a copy with me." Miss Marple did not exclaim or start. Her eyes merely sharpened slightly, the way a cat's will at the rustle of a mouse. "Left with you, my dear? That is very interesting. He gave it to me 2 days before the festival," Dorothy continued. "He said that if anything happened to him, I was to decide whether to bring it to the police or burn it. He thought it right that I should choose." Her voice caught. "I couldn't face it then. After your visit, after learning about my mother, after the kidnapping. Well, I read it at last. All of it. And I've decided." She placed the papers on the low table between them. "I burned the copy he left at the cottage," Dorothy said quietly. "The one they all thought they killed him for. He had hidden it behind a loose board in the skirting. I burned it in the vicarage stove the night before I disappeared. But this one, I think it should remain. Not to hurt anyone further, but in case truth is needed again one day." Miss Marple regarded the neat, tight script on the top page without touching it. "And what conclusion did you reach, my dear?" she asked gently. "About truth. It is not so simple as people think. Rather like medicines, some very beneficial, taken in proper doses, yet fatal if administered all at once or to the wrong constitution." Dorothy's eyes met hers steadily. "Mr. Crane believed everything ought to be dragged into the light at once. I don't. The Bantrys have never been anything but good to me. Colonel Bantry was wrong, terribly wrong years ago, but he did not kill my mother deliberately, and he has spent the rest of his life trying to make amends without quite admitting to himself what he did. That seems punishment of a kind." She drew a breath. "So I have told Aunt Dolly and the Colonel that I know the whole story, and that I choose to remain their daughter. I do not intend to give this to any court. I would only like someone honest to keep it, and you see so very much more clearly than the rest of us." Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. Outside, a robin chirped briskly from the pyracantha, unaware of the small human drama inside the cottage. "At my age," she said at last, "one accumulates more secrets than cardigans. But one also learns that some truths ripen, and some over-ripen into bitterness. I think Mr. Poole." Crane, for all his admirable courage, did not quite understand that difference. "Very well, my dear, I will keep these, for a time. And if I judge that their existence does more harm than good, I shall see that they are disposed of. Kindly." Relief flooded Dorothy's features. She rose, then impulsively bent to kiss Miss Marple's cheek before taking her leave. When the door closed behind her and the faint sound of her footsteps faded down the lane, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair and finally drew the papers toward her. She did not read them at once. She already knew their contents in essence. Human nature, laid out in legal phrasing, rarely surprised her. Instead, she opened the drawer of the old walnut bureau and placed the bundle at the very back, beneath neatly folded household accounts and a faded photograph of her brother as a boy. Later that afternoon, Inspector Slack called with what he clearly considered to be his final, formal report. "Trent's making a full confession," he said. "Our case will stand easily without any auxiliary observations." He colored slightly. "Not that yours weren't useful, of course." "Auxiliary things are often the most important," Miss Marple remarked. "The garnish on a plate may seem decorative, yet one often discovers it is where the clever cook has hidden the flavor. You will be satisfied, then, Inspector, that justice has been done." "As much as the law can manage," he replied. "Trent will hang. Ashford will likely serve time for complicity and fraud. The Bantrys, well, I expect scandal will do what no jury could. As for your Miss Dorothy, I gather she's standing by them." "She is," Miss Marple said, "and they by her. The law has had its portion. The rest belongs to conscience." "That is not your department, Inspector." He left shortly thereafter, softened by tea and the sense of a case properly closed. When the cottage was quiet again, Miss Marple sat with her knitting and watched the light fade from the autumn sky. The village would talk, of course. Villages always did, but in time the conversation would turn back to hens and weather and the vicar's unpruned roses. Human beings, she reflected, could not live continuously at the pitch of tragedy. They needed their smaller dramas, their harmless rumors, as surely as they needed bread and jam. Yet beneath it all, the deeper currents would remain. Guilt and forgiveness, weakness and courage, the choices made at the 11th hour that determined whether a life bent toward ruin or toward redemption. She picked up the blue cardigan and resumed her knitting. Each stitch followed upon the last, simple and inevitable. Yet the pattern emerging was far from simple. So it was, she thought, with people, and with crimes, and with confessions that came only when the clock stood very close to 12. In the quiet of her cottage, with the village settling into its evening routines beyond the hedges, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied sigh. Human nature, she knew, would go on being what it was, fallible, foolish, sometimes wicked, yet capable of unexpected grace. And as long as that remained true, there would always be puzzles to untangle, dropped stitches to recover, and patterns to perceive, here in St. Mary Mead and beyond. The winter that followed was one of those soft English winters. More rain than snow, more damp than drama, with bare hedges and low skies that made the world seem smaller and more intimate. In such weather, the village of St. Mary Mead folded in upon itself, content with its own company. church, shop, post office, and the quiet, relentless circulation of news. By then, the murder of Lionel Crane had already taken its first steps toward becoming a story rather than an open wound. Geoffrey Trent had been remanded for trial. Gerald Ashford had resigned from his practice in Much Benham and withdrawn from public life. And Colonel Bantry, after a serious talk with the chief constable, had been allowed to keep his position and reputation on the understanding that his earlier cowardice had been both punished and redeemed by subsequent suffering. Naturally, the village had opinions about all of this. "It's always the quiet ones," Mrs. Price declared in the grocer's, her voice rich with authority. "Mr. Trent never so much as looked at you twice. That kind always has something dreadful in their past. Mark my words, if people don't gossip a bit, you never know what they're hiding." Miss Marple, buying flour and currants, merely observed that gossip was a poor substitute for real understanding, but did not press the point. There are some lessons, she knew, that must be lived rather than explained. It was some weeks after the committal hearing, on a calm, grey afternoon in late January, that Inspector Slack appeared at Miss Marple's cottage with an air of reluctant purpose. The ground was slick with recent rain, and his boots left neat, damp marks on her mat before he remembered to wipe them. "You'll say I never give credit where it's due," he began, accepting a cup of tea with the wary air of a man aware that he is treading on novel ground. "But I thought you might like to know the final shape of things, officially." "That would be very kind, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, settling opposite him with her knitting, "though unofficial truth is often so much more interesting." He gave her a look half exasperated, half grudgingly admiring. "Well then, Trent's counsel tried to argue diminished responsibility, long-term obsession, bitterness over his sister's death, all that. The judge wasn't having it. Premeditation was plain as daylight. He followed Crane's movements, knew his intention to speak at the festival, chose his moment carefully, struck from behind, used the statuette because he knew it was there. And the kidnapping of Miss Dorothy Bantry, well, that put paid to any notion of temporary madness. And Mr. Ashford?" Miss Marple's needles clicked quietly. "Prosecution accepted a plea on lesser charges: conspiracy, fraud, failure to report an indictable offense. They'll suspend his sentence on condition he never practices law again. Health is poor, they say. To my mind, he's had 20-odd years of ill-gotten comfort. That's its own sort of punishment, when you know the bill's still to come." He drank his tea, then added almost as an afterthought, "The judge remarked, in summing up, that the real root of the whole business was cowardice and concealment. Your phrase, wasn't it? About secrets turning poisonous." "Not mine, Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly. "Human nature's." He snorted, but not unkindly. "What I still don't quite follow," he admitted, "is how you knew Trent was more than he appeared. Ashford, I could see. Solicitors are always mixed up in things one way or another. But Trent, just a quiet gentleman in a rented cottage. Until he wasn't." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It was rather a collection of small things," she said. "He knew too much, too quickly about local history. Newcomers don't usually take such lively interest in parish records and building deeds unless they have a particular reason. Then there was his reaction in the library when I mentioned the 1928 accident. Far too sharp for a casual tenant. And of course, there was the matter of the fire during the festival. Glossy paper, as I mentioned to you. Old photographs burn with a very particular smell. When one combines that with his face when I spoke of Sarah Miller, and the way he watched Dorothy when he thought no one was looking, it became clear he had some personal stake in the matter." Slack frowned. "Watching her? I hadn't heard that." "Most people don't look where they are not expecting to see anything," Miss Marple said gently. He watched her not with affection or dislike, but with a peculiar, hard sort of measuring, like a man looking at something he believes he has been cheated of. Sibling resentment, if you like, transmuted by years into something rather worse. The inspector was silent for a moment. "And the business at the mill house?" he asked at last. "That still bothers me." He left her alive, went to the trouble of hiding her. Why not kill her outright and have done with it? Miss Marple's expression grew a little sad. Because, Inspector, his quarrel was never truly with her. Dorothy represented an injustice in his mind, but he did not, in his own way, see her as guilty. His real hatred was for the Bantrys, and for everyone he believed had conspired to give them peace at his sister's expense. Killing Crane was revenge and self-preservation. Killing Dorothy would have been something else entirely, and he hadn't quite crossed that line. Not yet. He crossed enough of them, Slack said grimly. Still, I suppose it explains why the evidence at the mill was so contrived. He wanted to frighten them, force a reckoning, not, at least at first, to add another body. Exactly. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. That was his weakness in the end. A man who must arrange not only his actions but everyone else's perceptions of them will always leave too clear a pattern. True accidents are untidy. Trent could not bear untidiness. The inspector rose, setting down his empty cup. Well, he said awkwardly, I thought you ought to know. Officially, as I said. The chief constable has mentioned that your observations can be useful in village cases. That is very gratifying, Miss Marple replied, with genuine warmth, though I am sure the official methods will always be quite sufficient. He gave a short laugh at that and took his leave, boots thumping down the path. Miss Marple watched him go, then turned back to the quiet of her sitting room. Later that afternoon, Dorothy herself stopped by, bringing a small package in brown paper and string. A small thank you, she said, flushing slightly as Miss Marple unwrapped a delicate silver brooch in the shape of a sprig of rosemary. For remembrance, Dorothy added, but also for new beginnings. It is very beautiful, Miss Marple said, touched. And quite unnecessary, my dear. I only did what anyone with eyes, and perhaps a little memory, would have done. Dorothy shook her head. No, others had eyes. Only you chose to see. When she had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long while by the window, the brooch resting in her palm, the rain tracing familiar patterns down the glass. Cases ended, people healed, time passed. But what remained with her most strongly was not the exposure of Geoffrey Trent or the unmasking of Gerald Ashford, not even the tragic figure of Lionel Crane, steadfast in his lonely determination to tell the truth. It was instead the image of Dorothy standing at Blackwood Cottage, beneath the newly carved stone bearing her mother's name, and the look on her face, not of bitterness, nor of blind forgiveness, but of clear-eyed acceptance. That, Miss Marple thought, was justice in its truest form, not the neat closure of courts and verdicts, but the quiet courage to live honestly with what one knows. She pinned the little sprig of silver rosemary at her collar, took up her knitting once more, and let her mind drift, as it often did, to the inscrutable patterns of human nature, so prone to folly, so capable of kindness, and always, always interesting. Outside, St. Mary Mead continued in its small routine, children to school, letters to post, gossip to trade, plants to water. Somewhere, another small drama was undoubtedly beginning. Another tangle of motives and misunderstandings that might one day, if it turned dark enough, require an old lady with sharp eyes and a very long memory. But for now, the village was at peace. The 11th hour. Confession had been heard, the truth had done its quiet work, and in the modest sitting room on the corner of the High Street, Miss Jane Marple knitted steadily on, content to wait until human nature, as it invariably did, presented her with its next puzzle. She did not doubt it would.